Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to another edition of History and Truth. Today again, we are in Anjin House, a cake and coffee cafe in Hirado, Nagasaki, which has been here since 1502. This place it was particularly famous for being the home of William Adams. Japanese know him as Mura Anjin-san. Anjin means pilot. To get a better idea of who he was, there are two TV series of movies made called Shogun in 1980, which was 4 parts, 2 hours each, with Richard Chamberlain as the star. Blackthorn is Adams. And again, in 2024, another remake of the series was made. Okay, here we are at William Adams's house. He lived upstairs on the second floor. Today, we are going on with the regiments and units that served in Nova Scotia. Today, we'll start with the King's Orange Rangers. This unit was active from 1776 to 1783. It was a British provincial Rangers with an American command. It was auxiliaries, dragoons, and light infantry. It had 10 companies. In other words, 600 men, a battalion. Its garrison headquarters was Kingsbridge in Harlem, New York, and Fort Kippenhausen in the province of New York in 1776 to 78. Also in Halifax, Liverpool, and Liverpool in the province of Nova Scotia from 1778 to 1783. It served in the American Revolutionary War. The King's Orange Rangers, as you can see how they were dressed at the time. Also known as the Corps of King's Orange Rangers, were a British Loyalist battalion. United Empire Loyalists. This is the United Empire Loyalist flag, which is similar but wider than the flag of Great Britain. Notable is you can see one of the crosses is missing from the modern British flag, the Cross of St. Patrick, which wasn't added until later. Loyalists. At the beginning of the American Revolutionary War, it is said that 1/3 of the Americans rebelled against the crown. 1/3 remained loyal to the crown. They were referred to as the Loyalists. And 1/3 didn't care one way or another. So the war didn't bother them, regardless of who's fighting and who's winning. At the end of the war, many of the Loyalists accepted defeat and became Americans, just as anybody else would have been. But a large portion of them moved north, settling in southern Ontario, borderland of New Brunswick, and into Nova Scotia. The King's Orange Rangers were from this area. They were from Orange County, the province of New York, and they were raised in 1776 to defend British interests, and generally in and around the New York colony, although they saw most of their service in the province of Nova Scotia. The battalion's commander was Lieutenant Colonel John Bayard. Here's someone playing the colonel. The Rangers had an undistinguished military record through most of its existence and saw a very limited combat, mostly against Patriot privateers, but did not play an important role in the defense of the colony of Nova Scotia in the later years of the American Revolution. The King's Orange Rangers are especially remembered for their role in defense of Liverpool and the Nova Scotia colony. Battalion formed. In 1776, Sir William Howe accepted an offer from William Bayard of New York to raise a battalion to be called the King's Orange Rangers. Rangers were a type of light infantry which had served the British Army during the French and Indian War. Although, in the event, the KOR served as garrison troops for the duration. Bayard, who owned estates in New York and New Jersey, named one of his sons, John, to be colonel and another, Samuel, to be a captain. Within 4 months, about 200 men had been recruited, and the KOR was put on duty at King's Bridge at the northern tip of Manhattan Island. However, during the winter, the unit suffered much from smallpox and other disorders in the camp. Recruiting continued in 1777 with advertisements in the New York Gazette and the Weekly Mercury advising that recruits would receive 40 shillings advance with new clothes, arms, and accoutrements, and everything necessary to complete a gentleman volunteer. The regiment was still well under strength in July, and Colonel Alexander Innes, the Inspector General for Provincial Forces, reported that he was sorry to say that they are in a wretched state. During the remainder of the year, there were several altercations among the officers of the regiment, a state of affairs which continued, okay, which recurred throughout the regiment's existence. In March 1778, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Bayard, son of the founder of the regiment, William, was charged with murdering one of his own officers, Lieutenant William Byrd. Bayard was tried and found guilty of manslaughter in October and sentenced to be suspended for 3 months and then removed from his command. This sentence was overturned on a technicality by the Judge Advocate General, but probably played a role in Bayard's subsequent difficulties in retaining his command. In August, Colonel Innes received a letter from Edward Winslow in which he wrote, "I have, in free conversation, suggested my opinion to you that the Corps of King's Orange Rangers is at present in a position peculiarly alarming. Feuds and dissensions among the officers, mutinies and desertions among the men. Whether the present commandant is not sufficiently experienced in military matters, or whether by any other means there is in officers and men a want of that confidence in him which is essential to order and discipline in a new corps, I know not, but from the variety of unhappy events which have of late taken place, I apprehend one or the other. I am sensible that on days of public parade, such as inspections and musters, there is not a provincial corps in His Majesty's service more capable of distinguishing itself by a performance of military exercise and maneuvers than this, nor is there any better body of men." Nova Scotia. On November 17th, 1778, the KOR arrived by sea at Halifax, Nova Scotia. Here. The reason for the transfer was probably to stem the rate of desertion by relocating the men to a place much further away from their homes. The KOR was assigned to protect the Eastern Battery, here, on the shore of Halifax Harbor at the north end of Eastern Passage, where the community of Imperial now exists. During the later half of 1779, Captain Robert Rotten and his recruiting party were sent to Newfoundland in a joint effort with Lieutenant Hector McLean of the Royal Highland Emigrants. The two officers were quite successful, but did not finally leave St. John's bound for New York until December 17th. Adverse winter winds made it impossible to reach the northern American coast, so they changed course for the British Isles. On January 27, 1780, their vessel was wrecked on Bowfin Island, Galway, Ireland. 56 men died on passage or were drowned, while the survivors made their way to Halifax by the middle of that year. This expensive initiative did succeed in raising the strength of the regiment to 345 men. At about this time, Lieutenant Colonel Bayard learned of a plan to merge the KOR with the Royal Fencible Americans, which is the other unit we talked about, which would entail Bayard losing his command. He wrote in protest to Brigadier General Francis Maclean, who was a British Army officer, noting that he had already given up his commission with the 60th Regiment of Foot, and that the KOR currently had more men than the RFA. He wrote a similar letter to Sir Henry Clinton, the British CNC in North America. Clinton decided not to proceed with the plan at that time, but Bayard's position remained insecure. Liverpool. Here is the bottom of Nova Scotia. Here's Shelburne. Here's Liverpool. In the 1770s, Liverpool was the second largest settlement in Nova Scotia, after Halifax. Unlike Halifax, nearly everyone in Liverpool was a New England planter. The town was at first sympathetic to the cause of the American Revolution, while outlying outports like Port Medway and Port Mouton, other places along the way, almost continuously visited by American privateers. But after repeated attacks by American privateers on local shipping interests and one direct attack on the town itself, Liverpool citizens turned against the rebellion. Simeon Perkins wrote a successful appeal to the authorities in Halifax, and on December 13, 1778, Captain John Howard's company of the KOR arrived aboard the transport Hannah. The company consisted of Howard, 2 lieutenants, 1 ensign, 3 sergeants, 2 or 3 corporals, 48 privates, and several camp followers, both women and children. During the next year, the men assisted the locals in rebuilding Fort Morris, Nova Scotia, at what is today called Fort Point. This plaque is at Fort Morris and Liverpool. Here is a model of the fort at Fort Point. It was not long before the Rangers began to demonstrate the unreliability that had dogged them virtually from the time of their establishment. 6 men deserted from Fort Point on December 9, 1779, stealing a boat and making for Port Mouton. This was the first of several such incidents. Relations with the townspeople were often strained due to petty thefts, break-ins of local stores, including Perkins's, and suspicions of locals aiding deserters. On the other hand, a number of KOR men married local women. As Liverpool began to outfit privateers of their own, Howard bought shares and agreed to have his men serve as Marines on board. The raid on Liverpool in 1780. The most dramatic privateer raid occurred on September 13, 1780. 2 American privateers, the Surprise under Captain Benjamin Cole and the Delight under Captain Lane, unloaded nearly 70 men at Ballast Cove shortly after midnight. By 4 a.m., they had captured the fort and taken Howard, 2 other officers, and all but 6 of the KOR garrison as prisoners. Perkins called out the militia, engineered the capture of the Cole, and negotiated with Lane for the recovery of the fort and the release of the prisoners. Within a few hours, everything was restored to its former situation without any bloodshed. Liverpool was not bothered by privateers for the remainder of the war. Most of Howard's company was ordered back to Halifax in mid-1781, but owing to appeals by the town's leaders, a detachment of 20 men under Lieutenant MacLeod remained for the duration. Here we are with Port Williams again. Port Williams is here. At Port Williams, Nova Scotia, the threat of American privateer attacks had subsided. In the spring of 1781, Major Samuel Bayard ordered to take a detachment of Rangers overland from Halifax to Fort Hughes, Nova Scotia, to overawe the local planters who were planning to erect a liberty pole and thereby break with the king. A liberty pole is basically a declaration of rebellion. They there, the King's Orange Rangers fixed bayonets and with bright weapons glittering, colors flying, and drums beating, they marched up Church Street and back to Town Plot, where the barracks stood. This show of force brought the locals back in line. Bayard took an interest in the Annapolis Valley, and after the war, he took up a grant of 4,730 acres at Wilmot Mountain. Here is a plaque and a monument to Samuel Bayard at the King of the King's Orange Rangers. This is at Middleton Park in Middleton, Nova Scotia, Canada. Middleton is also the location of D Company of the West Nova Scotia Regiment. The reputation of the regiment grew in these later years. A few months before disbandment, Brigadier General Henry Edward Cox expressed the great satisfaction he had received in seeing the two provincial battalions of Royal Nova Scotia Volunteers and the King's Orange Rangers, and highly approves of their discipline and military appearance. The King's Orange Rangers were disbanded in the autumn of 1783. Those officers and men who wished received land grants in the area of Quaco, New Brunswick, which is now known as Funday St. Martin's. The uniforms. In 1776, the men of the KOR mostly wore civilian clothing, essentially whatever they were wearing when enlisted. Their first uniforms arrived in early 1777, which were green coats faced white, with white small clothes, in common with most other Loyalist corps of the American command at that time. In keeping with their name, the regiment was issued with red coats faced with orange from 1780 to their disbandment. So they began to look like any other British soldier. Orange facings. As Rangers, their coats were most likely unlaced. The Royal Nova Scotia Volunteer Regiment, or the Loyal Regiment of Nova Scotia Volunteers from 1775 to 1780, and the Royal Regiment of Nova Scotia Volunteers from 1780 to 1783. So this was garrison troops of 5 to 6 companies, or about a battalion. Its garrison headquarters was Halifax and Fort Sackville. There also was a garrison in Prince Edward Island. They were engaged in the American Revolutionary War. They never saw combat. The Royal Nova Scotia Volunteer Regiment, also known as the Loyal Regiment of Nova Scotia Volunteers and the Loyal Nova Scotia Volunteers, from 1775 to 1780, the Royal Regiment of Nova Scotia Volunteers from 1780 to 1783, and the Royal Nova Scotia Volunteer Regiment and Nova Scotia Volunteers, was a British Loyalist provincial battalion of infantry raised in 1775 to defend British interests in the colony of Nova Scotia. The unit was commanded by Colonel Francis Legge until replaced by Colonel John Parr in 1782. The Royal Nova Scotia Volunteers never saw combat, but did play an important role in the defense of the colony of Nova Scotia in the later years of the American Revolution. This is Hibbert Newton Binney, this is the only known portrait of someone in the regiment. Francis Legge was appointed the Royal Governor of Nova Scotia in 1773, just as troubles were brewing in the American colonies. Legge, an earnest but highly prejudiced and therefore much disliked man, proposed to the Secretary of State on July 31st, 1775, that he be permitted to raise a regiment of 1,000 men to be recruited from the German, neutral, and Irish settlers in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. Legge had grave doubts about the loyalty of the New England planters, who made up the majority of Nova Scotia's settlers at this point. Lake's distrust was not entirely misplaced, as the Eddy Rebellion was to prove. He proposed the name of Royal Nova Scotia Volunteers, but this was denied and changed to Loyal. Sometime around 1780, the Royal designation was bestowed for the duration of the war. Francis Lake received a dispatch from London dated October 16, 1775, authorizing him to raise the Loyal Regiment of Nova Scotia Volunteers as a fencible unit. Fencible meaning like a regular regiment, but not to serve outside of North America, for strictly local defense. The recruits were to be paid and equipped like regular soldiers. They would be, in effect, a full-time home guard. The officers of the Royal Nova Scotia Volunteers were mostly lawyers and other men of the Halifax establishment and Francis Lake's political hangers-on, with little or no military experience, along with a number of subalterns brought in from the British fleet. The most distinguished senior officer was George Henry Monk, who became major and served for the duration. Recruiting for the Loyal Regiment of Nova Scotia Volunteers proved to be extremely difficult owing to Francis Lake's unpopularity. He was finally ordered back to Britain in May 1776, although he remained colonel and governor in absentia until replaced by John Parr in 1782. Despite a recruiting bounty of 2 guineas, by April 1776, only 60 men had been mustered, at very heavy expense. The officers were so discouraged that they sent a petition of grievances to the Secretary of State on June 14th. Rather than being trained as soldiers, the men were sent to Spanish River, Cape Breton, to dig coal for the army. The next summer, 40 men went back to colliery, while 20 served as Marines on the Royal Navy sloop HMS Gage. The subalterns were returned to the fleet. Service duties. As resentment of Francis Lake died away, the fortunes of the Loyal Regiment changed. Returns show that by February 1780, 568 men had enlisted and 92 had deserted, for an overall strength of 476 rank and file. This was very close to the reauthorized strength of a half battalion of 500 men. Due to officer absences, the unit was under day-to-day command of the senior captain, John Solomon, at Fort Sackville. The volunteers were taking up a full share of garrison duties in Halifax and several outposts. Again, Fort Sackville is here at the mouth of the Sackville River. Its remains and monument is directly behind the Sunnyside Mall in Bedford. So the volunteers were taking a full share of garrison duties in Halifax and several outposts. Given the importance of Halifax to the overall British war effort, this was a useful employment. In 1782, a detachment was sent to the island of St. John, to the mouth of the St. John River. Not only the size, but the desirable reputation of the Loyal Nova Scotia Volunteers grew in later years. A few months before disbandment, Brigadier General Henry Edward Fox expressed the great satisfaction he has received in seeing the 2 provincial battalions of Royal Nova Scotia Volunteers and the King's Orange Rangers, and highly approves of their discipline and military appearance, more particularly of the soldier-like maneuvers and quick step of the Royal Nova Scotia Volunteers, which had so much the appearance of troops that had been employed in active service. The uniforms. In 1775 to 1776, the men of the volunteers mostly wore civilian clothing, essentially whatever they were wearing when they enlisted. Their first uniforms arrived in early 1777, which were green coats faced white, with white smallclothes, in common with most other loyalist corps of the American command at that time. Officers wore silver lace, and by 1779, the regiment was wearing red coats faced buff An officer's medal had changed to gold. There is a reference to red coats faced green in 1783. The regiment was disbanded. The Loyal Nova Scotia Volunteer Regiment was disbanded at noon on Monday, October 20th, 1783. The officers went on half pay, and those officers and men who wished received land grants in the area of Ship Harbor. Captain Thomas Green, 2 sergeants, 5 corporals, and 22 private soldiers, some with their families, took up grants ranging from 100 to 450 acres. Captain Timothy William Hireleahy and his father, Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Hireleahy, of the regiment, settled in Antigonish. Captain Island and Captain Pond are named after the son. Okay, next, the Royal Nova Scotia Regiment. This unit was active. This is Colonel John Wentworth. This unit was active from 1793 to 1802. Okay, it was 6 companies, right, and it rose up to 8 companies. Its garrisons were in Halifax, St. John's, Newfoundland, St. John's, Newfoundland, Annapolis Royal, Windsor, Fort Edward, and Sydney, Nova Scotia. The Royal Nova Scotia Regiment, or the Nova Scotia Fencibles, was a battalion of infantry raised in 1793 to defend British interests in the colony of Nova Scotia during the Wars of the French Revolution. The unit was commanded by Colonel John Wentworth, this guy, the Lieutenant Governor of the colony, throughout its existence. The Royal Nova Scotia Regiment, the RNSR, had an undistinguished history through most of its existence and saw very limited action, mostly in the role of Marines, but did not play an important role in the defense of Nova Scotia during these wars. Formation. This is Brenton Halliburton. This is the only known portrait of someone in the regiment. As tensions rose between the governments of Britain and Revolutionary France in early 1793, the British Secretary of State for the Colonies, Henry Dundas, wrote to Wentworth that the question of raising a provincial regiment for the defense of Nova Scotia was under consideration. In April, word arrived in Halifax, also from Dundas, that war had been declared. All but 200 men of the British garrison were to be sent to the West Indies, that the militia was to be called out, and that Wentworth was to commence raising a provincial regiment of 6 companies, 600 men. In spite of having no military experience, Wentworth was to be colonel of the regiment. The regiment was to serve as a fencible unit, only for local defense only. The men were to be paid and equipped like regular soldiers. They would be, in effect, a full-time home guard. In October, Wentworth was directed to raise the establishment to 8 companies, 800 men, although the regiment would not, in the event, ever reach this strength, and further ordered that the regiment might be called on to serve in the other North American colonies, to which the men assented. Wentworth went to work on this project with enthusiasm. Winkworth Tonge, Jr., formerly adjutant of the 60th Regiment of Foot, as well as an officer of the Royal Fencible Americans and the 22nd Regiment of Foot, was appointed as adjutant, and recruiting began on April 14th. By May 28th, 350 men had been enlisted. Wentworth was keen to have this regiment given the prefix Royal, probably based on the president of the Royal Nova Scotia Volunteer Regiment of the Revolutionary War. In October, Dundas granted this, but without special sanction. Many of the officers of the RNSR were veterans of the earlier war, or sons of veterans. For example, Samuel Bayard, named as Lieutenant Colonel en second, had served as a captain in the King's Orange Rangers. Major George H. Monk and Captains Jones Fawson and John Solomon had held the same ranks in the Royal Nova Scotia Volunteers, while Captain Hector McLean had served with the 84th Highlanders. There was a labor shortage in Nova Scotia at the time, and many Halifax merchants, led by John Butler, began to protest to Wentworth that his recruiting efforts were driving up wages. This opposition soon collapsed when the merchants began to realize the lucrative contracts that the war effort was bringing. Butler even had the effrontery to apply to Dundas for a contract to supply the regiment. Wentworth also faced difficulties from Major General Ogilvy, the commander of the regular garrison, who refused his requests for barrack space, clothing, and provisions, while at the same time using Wentworth's men for three-quarters of the garrison's duties and as the source of recruits for his own 4th Regiment of Foot. This state of affairs was finally ended in May 1794 with the arrival of Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, to take over as Commander-in-Chief of the King's forces in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Wentworth and the Prince were to form a friendship over the coming years, much to the benefit of the RNSR. Service. During its existence, the RNSR had its headquarters in Halifax, where it assisted in doing garrison duty and had small parties in all of the outposts in the neighborhood and other parts of the province. These guys were the garrisons of all the little forts. A fairly large detachment, successively under command of Captain McLean, Captain Aldridge, and Lieutenant Van Cortlandt, was at St. John's, Newfoundland, from August 1794 until November 1795, assisting in raising and training of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. Other detachments were at Annapolis Royal, Windsor, and Sydney. For a short while, a guard was posted at Parsborough to protect the north end of the ferry link across the Minas Basin from Windsor to Partridge Island, the fastest route of the time from Halifax to New Brunswick. That would have been at Fort Belcher, near Truro. As of July 1st, 1797, the officers and men of the RNSR were distributed as follows. At Halifax Citadel, 66. At Prince Edward's Quarter at Birch Cove, 42. At Eastern Battery, 96. At George's Island, 77. At Port Sandwich, or the York Battery, 91. At Point Pleasant Battery, 50. At Northwest Arm Battery, 23. At Kavanaugh's, or Melville Island, 16. At Fort Sackville, 34. At Windsor, Fort Edward, 31. At Annapolis Royal, Fort Anne, 31. Aboard the Earl of Moira as Marines, 36. At Duncan's Cove at Chebucto Head, 7. At Sambro Lighthouse, 4. On leave, 2. Orderlies at Regimental Hospital, 2. Telegraph or semaphore, men on Citadel Hill, 2. King's Workmen at Halifax, 5. For a total of 618, of which 524 were other ranks. There were wanting 273 to complete the establishment. A detachment of 40 to 50 men were always stationed at the Prince's residence as a sort of guard of honor. The men posted at Sambro, Duncan's Cove, and the 2 men at Citadel operated the semaphore telegraph that the Prince established to relay messages from the mouth of the harbor to his headquarters. It was the first of its kind in North America. The men at Kavanaugh's Island guarded French prisoners from La Felix, a ship captured at Santo Domingo in 1794. The island was renamed in honor of Dundas, Lord Melville, after the war. A rotation of men, from 14 to 36 at the time, served as Marines aboard His Majesty's armed Snow, Earl of Moira, which was a vessel of 14 guns in the pay of the province, commanded by Captain Fawson. These were probably the only men of the regiment to see combat. Here is the gravestone of Lieutenant Benjamin James of the Royal Nova Scotia Regiment. This is in the old burying ground in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He died while trying to rescue those who died in the HMS Tribune in 1797, which was commemorated by Prince Edward. Prince Edward took almost as much pride in the regiment as Wentworth did. However, he also saw it as a source of recruits for his own 7th Regiment of Foot, the Royal Fusiliers. Already in 1795, he had persuaded several officers of the RNSR to take up commissions in the 7th of Foot, and he later decided on a plan to draft into his own regiment the best men of the RNSR in exchange for some poor quality recruits he had received from Britain. Wentworth was horrified, in part because the prince was known as a very severe disciplinarian. He wrote in protest to the Duke of Portland, who sent a mild reprimand to the prince, ordering him not to use the RNSR as a nursery or recruiting fund, because the men had enlisted as fencibles. Fear of being drafted into the Fusiliers caused recruiting to dry up for several months. The prince did throw his influence behind Wentworth's persistent efforts to have the regiment placed on the British Army's regular establishment, which would have, among other things, secured a colonel's salary for Wentworth, but these efforts came to nothing. On November 16, 1797, the frigate HMS Tribune was wrecked during a southerly gale off Herring Cove. Lieutenant Benjamin James, Sergeants William Mullins and Sniffen Baker, and Privates Michael Brown, Cornelius Kenrick, John Bush, and William Barry, all of the RNSR, were drowned attempting to rescue the crew of the Tribune. It is said of the prince, in referring to Lieutenant James, stating that the flower of my regiment is gone. This is that guy again. Disbandment. The Royal Nova Scotia Regiment was disbanded at Halifax on August 24, 1802, following the Treaty of Amiens. Wentworth's biographer, Brian C. Cuthbertson, sums up the regiment's service as follows. At a time when Nova Scotians needed patriotic symbols and reassurance in the face of threatened attack, the Royal Nova Scotia Regiment filled a vital need and did so most commendably. It was a fine body of men, well officered, and one in which Wentworth and all Nova Scotians took pride. By the end of October, those men who wished had been given land grants and in various districts of the province. Many of the officers and men would go on to do further service in the Nova Scotia Regiment of Fencible Infantry, which was raised in July 1803 after the renewal of the war with France. One of these officers was Henry Newton, who joined the 32nd Regiment of Foot at the request of the Duke of Kent. Newton was killed at the Battle of Salamanca. Uniforms. This is a Royal Nova Scotia Regiment tunic, a jacket, actually called a coatee. This is particularly interesting, is it's very rare to find a uniform of this time still in existence. At the time of their enlistment, the men of the RNSR mostly wore civilian clothing, essentially whatever they were wearing when enlisted. Wentworth's difficulties with Ogilvy delayed the outfitting of the regiment with proper uniforms, although Wentworth had ordered them from England in May 1793, asking Captain Stewart of the Life Guards to advise and aid in the fashion and selection of them. With the arrival of Prince Edward in 1794, the regiment was soon fully clothed. Remarkably, a uniform coatee of a man of the RNSR still exists. This one. This coatee is one of the earliest surviving military uniforms known to exist in Canada and is currently held at the Army Museum at the Halifax Citadel. It confirms that the RNSR wore red coats with royal blue facings, with plain white lace for other ranks and buttons in pairs. Given the wings on the shoulders, this would have been the coatee of a man of the Grenadier or the Light Infantry Company. This uniform would have been worn about 1798.